The barricade came out of nowhere. 3 black cars pulled nose to tail across the harbor road. Headlights aimed straight into Mara Voss's windshield like a wall of white fire. In the back of her ambulance, a 17-year-old girl was losing blood faster than the 4-line could replace it. "Talk to me," Mara said into the radio, one hand steady on the wheel, the other already reaching back to check the pressure dressing on the girl's abdomen. "Dispatch, I've got a civilian roadblock on Harbor and 9th. I need this cleared now." Dispatch didn't answer. Dispatch never answered on this stretch of road. Everyone at City EMS knew that once you crossed into the harbor district, you were on your own. That was the district that belonged to a man named Dante Kovarik, and nobody, not even ambulances, moved through it without permission. A man in a long charcoal coat stepped into her headlights and raised one hand, flat, unhurried, like he was stopping traffic for a parade instead of a dying girl. 2 more men flanked him, hands resting near their jackets in a way that wasn't casual at all. "Turn around," he called. "This road is closed tonight." Mara looked back at her patient. The girl's lips had gone the color of ash. Her monitor was chirping a rhythm that meant minutes, not hours. And then Mara saw the girl's face clearly for the first time under the dome light, and something cold moved through her chest, because she recognized it. She'd seen that face in a newspaper photo taped to the breakroom corkboard 2 weeks ago, under a headline about a shipping dispute and a name that made even her supervisor lower his voice. Calloway. This wasn't just an injured teenager. This was the daughter of the one man in this city that Dante Kovarik hated more than anyone alive. Which meant the men standing in her headlights had no idea whose blood was pooling on the gurney behind her. Or they knew exactly whose blood it was, and that was worse. The man in the coat took 2 steps closer, patient, certain she would obey. Mara's hands didn't shake. They never shook. Not once in 6 years of driving into the worst nights of strangers' lives. She thought of her rule, the only rule that had kept her safe this long in every district, with every kind of danger she'd ever hauled through a windshield. You drive, you don't ask, you get them there. Tonight that rule was about to get her killed, or it was about to save a life nobody in that barricade wanted saved. She looked at the gap between the second and third car. 18 inches, maybe 20, just wide enough if she didn't think too hard about it. "Ma'am," the man called louder now, a warning instead of a request. "I said turn around." Behind Mara, her partner Priya was reciting numbers in a voice gone thin with fear. Blood pressure dropping, pulse climbing, the vitals of a body running out of time to argue with anyone. Mara didn't look away from the man in the coat. She'd learned, over 6 years of nights like this one, that hesitation cost more than danger did. A siren wailed somewhere behind the barricade, distant and useless. Some other emergency the city was busy having while hers stalled here in the dark. The man took another step. Close enough now that Mara could see he wasn't afraid of her. Why would he be? A woman in a boxy white ambulance against 3 cars and however many more men waited just out of the headlights' reach. He believed, the way powerful men always believed, that his order was the only variable in this equation that mattered. He didn't know about the girl bleeding out 4 feet behind Mara's seat. He didn't know her name, or that the man giving these orders would have wanted her saved more than almost anyone in this city, if only he understood who she was. All he knew was a checkpoint and an ambulance that hadn't been cleared, and in his world, that was reason enough to hold the line. Mara put the ambulance in gear. "Hold on," she told her patient, though the girl was too far gone to hear her. "We're not stopping." She hit the gas. The gap between the second and third car came up fast, closer to 16 inches than the 20 she'd guessed, and for one long heartbeat Mara felt the mirror catch metal, heard the shriek of it tearing free, and didn't ease off the pedal at all. Shouting erupted behind her. Not gunfire, not yet, just furious voices and the slam of car doors. And in the mirror she watched the man in the charcoal coat stand motionless in her taillights instead of drawing a weapon, watching the ambulance go the way a man watches a decision he already regrets making. "Bearing right in 3 blocks, Priya called from the back, her voice steadier now that they were moving again, one hand still pressed hard against gauze that was already darkening. "Mara, she's crashing." "Stay with me," Mara said, not sure if she was talking to Priya or to the girl or to herself. The road opened ahead of her. Harbor District giving way at last to ordinary city blocks, streetlights instead of headlight walls, and somewhere past the next intersection, the glow of the hospital's emergency entrance rose up like a promise she intended to keep no matter what waited for her on the other side of it. 3 weeks earlier, Mara Voss's biggest problem had been her brother's tuition bill and a supervisor who kept scheduling her for the Harbor District shifts nobody else wanted. She was 29, 4 years into paramedic work, the kind of good at her job that came from paying attention instead of trusting instinct. She'd learned to read a body the way other people read a room, the angle of a bruise, the pattern of a burn, the difference between a wound that happened the way someone said it happened and a wound that didn't. Her supervisor, a tired, decent man named Reyes, called it her eye. Mara called it just doing the job right. She lived in a small apartment above a laundromat with her younger brother, Eli, who was 19 and stubborn and brilliant, and who had one more semester of community college standing between him and the engineering program he'd wanted since he was 12. Their mother had died 3 years ago, and the money from her insurance had run out faster than either of them expected. Mara's job wasn't just a job. It was the thing keeping Eli's future intact. "You keep taking the harbor shifts," Eli told her one night over reheated noodles, "and one day you're going to drive into something you can't drive out of." "Nobody bothers the ambulance," she said. "That's the one rule down there. Everybody needs one eventually." It was true as far as it went. In the Harbor District, the rule of the streets belonged to Dante Kovarik, a man Mara had never met but had heard about the way you hear about weather systems. Something you planned around, not something you argued with. He ran the docks, the warehouses, half the shipping contracts on that side of the city. And he did it, people said, with more restraint than his father ever had. Dante didn't like unnecessary blood. He liked control. He believed, genuinely believed, that the men who had built his organization beside him for 15 years had earned the right to run their corners without him looking over their shoulders. That belief had a name. Victor Lasco, his underboss, the man who'd been at Dante's father's side before Dante was even born, and who now ran the day-to-day muscle of the family with a smile so easy that new hires sometimes forgot to be afraid of him. In public, Victor was warm, the uncle everyone wished they had, the man who remembered your kid's birthday. In the back rooms, he was something else. He watched Dante modernize the business. Legitimate shipping fronts, cleaner books, fewer bodies. And every year, Victor felt 1 year further from the center of things. He said nothing. He smiled. He waited. 2 nights before the barricade, Victor stood on the loading dock with a burner phone in his hand, speaking low to someone Dante didn't know. And when a young runner walked past too close, Victor pocketed the phone so fast the boy never saw it at all. "The Calloway girl," Victor murmured to the voice on the line, "isn't supposed to be anywhere near the East Pier tonight. Make sure she is." Dante, 3 blocks away, was telling his lieutenants that no ambulance, ever, gets stopped on his roads for longer than it takes to confirm it isn't a Calloway trick. "We are not animals," he said. "We don't need to be." Nobody in that room knew that within 48 hours, his own order would be the only reason his worst enemy's daughter survived the night, or that the man standing 3 feet from him already knew exactly what was coming. At the end of her shift that week, Reyes pulled Mara aside. "Something's moving in the Harbor District," he said. "Word is there's tension between Kovarik and Calloway again. If dispatch sends you down there, you radio in every 10 minutes. You understand me?" Mara said she understood. She didn't yet know how little that would matter. There was a version of Mara's life once that hadn't revolved around Harbor District shifts and her brother's tuition ledger. Before their mother died, Mara had talked about going back to school herself, maybe nursing, maybe something further. A version of the future that had quietly folded itself up and gone into a drawer the week the funeral bills arrived. She didn't resent it, not exactly. She'd built something steady out of what was left. A small apartment, a reliable paycheck, a brother who was going to have the future she'd set aside for herself. That was enough. Had to be. Dante Kovarik's world ran on a different kind of arithmetic, but it wasn't so different underneath. His father had built the family's harbor holdings out of nothing but nerve and a willingness to be the last man standing in every negotiation, and Dante had spent his whole life learning to be something quieter and, he believed, better. A man who solved problems with contracts and patience instead of blood, wherever that was possible. He trusted the men who had built that world beside his father because distrust, in his experience, was what had gotten his father killed young. Loyalty, unquestioned, was the one inheritance Dante had never thought to examine. Victor Lasco had been at Dante's christening. Victor had taught him to drive, had stood beside him at his father's funeral with a hand on his shoulder steady enough to hold up a grieving 22-year-old boy who suddenly ran half the harbor. For 15 years, Dante had never once needed to ask whether Victor's loyalty was real, because the question had simply never occurred to him. That, more than any single decision, was the crack the whole story would eventually run through. 2 nights before the barricade, standing on the loading dock with the burner phone warm in his hand, Victor watched the harbor's newer, legitimate shipping business hum along without him. Container manifests, insurance paperwork, lawyers instead of leverage, and felt, not for the first time, like a tool being quietly retired. He told himself he was doing this to protect his own relevance. He didn't examine too closely what that protection was going to cost someone else. The call came in at 11:42 p.m. Gunshot wound, East Pier, female, approximately 17. Mara and her partner that night, a quiet second-year named Priya, were the closest unit. They found the girl behind a stack of shipping containers, alone except for a terrified dockworker who'd called it in and then run. No shooter. No witnesses who'd admit to being witnesses. Just a girl in a torn jacket, blood soaking through at her side, breathing too fast and too shallow. Mara knelt beside her the way she'd knelt beside hundreds of strangers, hands already moving. Pressure, airway, while her mind did the other thing it always did, the thing Reyes called her eye. She looked at the wound. Single entry, no exit. Close range, judging by the stippling pattern around the torn fabric. Not the wide, chaotic scatter of a crossfire between 2 moving groups, which was what the panicked dockworker had described when he called it in. They were shooting at each other, she got caught in it. That wasn't what this wound said. This wound said someone had stood close enough to see her face and pulled the trigger anyway. Mara filed the thought away. Not now, get her to the hospital first, and helped Priya lift the girl onto the gurney. That was when she saw the necklace, a small gold pendant shaped like an anchor, and beneath it, tucked into the collar of the jacket, a laminated card that had slipped half out of a pocket. A school ID. Sofia Calloway. Mara's stomach dropped the way it did on a bridge in high wind. She had grown up in the city long enough to know that name, and to know exactly which direction they'd have to drive to reach the nearest trauma center. Straight through the heart of Harbor District, straight through territory that belonged to the one man in this city who had every reason in the world to want a Calloway to bleed out rather than survive. Priya, she said, closing the doors. Whatever happens on this drive, you do not tell anyone her last name. Not dispatch, not anyone. Not until we're inside those hospital doors. Priya, pale, nodded. They made it 4 blocks before the barricade. In the moment the black cars blocked the road, Mara had exactly 2 real choices, and she understood both of them with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. She could turn around, backtrack, and take the longer route around the district, a 14-minute detour her patient did not have. Or she could go through, and risk whatever waited on the other side of men who worked for the girl's enemy. She thought of Eli's tuition. She thought of her license, her job, the 6 years she'd spent becoming someone who didn't panic. None of it mattered as much in that second as the thin, fading pulse under her fingers. She drove through the gap. The side mirror clipped one of the black cars hard enough to shear it off entirely. She heard shouting behind her, heard an engine roar to life in pursuit, and didn't slow down. In the rear view, she watched the man in the charcoal coat lower the phone he'd been reaching for and instead simply stand there, watching her ambulance disappear toward the hospital. His expression unreadable. She didn't know yet that the man's name was Andre, that he was Dante Kovarik's second cousin and closest driver, or that within 10 minutes he would deliver a report that would bring Dante Kovarik himself to the hospital doors. Not to finish what the barricade had started, but to find out exactly who had dared to break it. In the front seat, Priya let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since the mirror shattered. "You're going to lose your license for this," she said, not quite a question. "Maybe," Mara said. "She's not going to lose her life for it. That's the trade I'm making." Priya didn't argue. She just reached back and adjusted the drip line one more time, The way you check a knot you've already tied twice, because checking it a third time is the only thing left within your control. Sirens found them 2 blocks from the hospital. A police escort, summoned by someone at dispatch who'd finally answered, though far too late to matter. Mara didn't slow for them either. They simply fell in behind her, lights flashing uselessly, an authority that had shown up only after the danger was already behind her instead of in front. By the time she wheeled into the ambulance bay, 3 trauma nurses were already waiting at the doors, alerted by a radio call. Priya had finally managed to get through once they'd cleared the barricade, and the whole team moved together with a kind of practiced urgency that made the previous 10 minutes feel, for one suspended second, almost survivable. What neither of them could see, 3 blocks behind, was André standing beside his damaged car making a call of his own, not to punish the ambulance driver who'd broken through, but to Dante directly, describing a woman who hadn't flinched, who hadn't begged, who had simply made a choice and driven through the consequences of it. André had worked the harbor roads for 6 years. He had never once seen anyone do that. Mara backed the ambulance into the ER bay, threw the doors open, and started calling out vitals before the trauma team even reached the gurney. It was only after Sofia Calloway had disappeared through the double doors into surgery, only after the adrenaline began to ebb, that Mara looked down and saw the blood on her own hands and understood, with total clarity, that she had just driven straight into the middle of a war. By morning, Mara's name was in 3 places she never wanted it to be: a hospital incident report, a city EMS disciplinary file, and, though she didn't know it yet, a folder on Dante Kovarik's desk. Reyes met her before her shift, his face grim. "You entered a restricted operational zone against a direct barricade," he said, reading from a printout like it hurt him to say the words. "You're suspended pending review." "I'm sorry, Mara. This isn't me. This came from above. There was a 17-year-old bleeding out in the back of my rig," Mara said. "I did my job." "I know." Reyes lowered his voice. "But somebody with a lot of money made a call to the hospital administrator this morning, and somebody else made a call to city EMS. I don't know which side. Maybe both." She found out which side by mid-afternoon, when a hospital administrator named Corwin sat her down in his office and slid a prepared statement across the desk, one that described Sofia Calloway's injury as consistent with crossfire during an altercation between rival parties, with no mention of entry angle, no mention of range. "Sign it," Corwin said. "It closes the file cleanly." "It's not true," Mara said. "The wound pattern doesn't match crossfire. I've seen 100 gunshot wounds. That was close range, deliberate, and if I sign my name to a lie about a minor's medical record, I lose my license the day anyone checks." Corwin's jaw tightened. "There are people who would prefer this stayed simple. Then those people can find someone else's name to put on it." Corwin didn't push further, but he didn't apologize either, and the silence between them as Mara gathered her bag felt like its own kind of answer. A hospital administrator caught between 2 dangerous families and a paramedic who refused to make his job easier by lying. "You understand what you're choosing," he said finally. Not quite a threat, not quite a warning, something in between. "Once you decide not to sign this, you don't get to undecide it later if things get difficult." "I know exactly what I'm choosing," Mara said. "I chose it back on that road 3 nights ago. This is just paperwork catching up to a decision I already made with a girl's life in the balance." She left without signing. That evening, her downstairs neighbor mentioned that a well-dressed man had come by twice asking after her, polite, unthreatening, leaving no name, and something about the story told secondhand made the hair on Mara's arms stand up. She recognized, without being told, that this was not police. This was Harbor District reaching into her ordinary life for the first time. Eli noticed the change in her before she said a word about it. The way she checked the deadbolt twice. The way she kept glancing at her phone like she expected it to do something other than ring. "You're scaring me," he said, over the noodles neither of them was really eating. "Talk to me." "I did my job," Mara said. "Sometimes that's complicated for other people." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now." She reached across and squeezed his hand, the way she had every night since their mother's funeral. A small private ritual that meant we're still standing, whatever else is true. "Finish your semester. Let me handle the rest." She didn't tell him about the wound pattern, or the name Calloway, or the growing certainty settling into her chest that she had accidentally stepped into the exact center of something much larger than a single bad night. Some things she'd decided a long time ago were hers to carry so he wouldn't have to. At the depot the next morning, she found out the dashcam footage from the ambulance had been wiped. Not corrupted, not lost, wiped cleanly by someone with the depot's access codes, sometime after midnight when only 2 people had clearance to be there. That was the same night Mara, working a private hunch, called an old contact in dispatch records and asked for the GPS logs of every Harbor District vehicle active near the East Pier at 11:30 p.m. It took her 2 hours and one favor she'd have to repay to get an answer. The name that came back, cross-referenced against a Calloway Street soldier the papers were already blaming for the shooting, told her something the papers hadn't printed. That soldier's phone had pinged a cell tower 6 miles away at 11:38 p.m., 4 minutes before the shooting, on the wrong side of the city to have fired the shot. Whoever shot Sofia Calloway, it wasn't the man everyone was about to go to war over. Mara sat with that fact for a long time, turning it over, because she understood exactly what it meant. If the official story was wrong, someone had built it that way on purpose. And someone with Harbor District Depot access had erased the only footage that could prove it. She was still sitting with the phone in her hand when a black car pulled up outside the laundromat, and a man stepped out who didn't need an introduction. She recognized him instantly from the news photo beside Sofia Calloway's. Dante Kovarik. She thought, absurdly, of the anchor pendant she'd seen around Sofia's neck 4 nights earlier, and of the 4-minute gap in a dead-end alibi that no one else in this city seemed to want examined too closely. Whoever had built the official story around this shooting had built it fast and clean, and confident that nobody would ever check the seams. Mara had spent 6 years learning to notice exactly the kind of thing people hoped she wouldn't. She wasn't going to stop now because the seams belonged to a dangerous man's organization instead of an ordinary crime scene. He didn't come inside with muscle or threats. He came alone, hands visible, and waited on the sidewalk until Mara opened the door herself. "You broke through my barricade," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded, if anything, like a question he wanted answered honestly. "There was a dying girl in my ambulance," Mara said. "I'd have broken through anyone's barricade." Something in his face shifted. Not quite respect, not yet, but the beginning of it. "My men were told to hold that road because I believed the Calloways were moving weapons through it. I gave that order to protect my own people. Instead, my own barricade nearly killed the daughter of the man I was protecting them from." "She's not dead," Mara said. "No thanks to whoever shot her." She almost didn't tell him the rest. Every instinct built over 6 years of staying out of other people's business told her to shut the door and let this man's world solve its own violence without her. But she thought of the wiped footage, the pressure to sign a false statement, and the 4-minute gap in a dead man's alibi, and she understood that silence wasn't safety anymore. Silence was exactly what someone wanted from her. "The soldier your people are blaming," she said, "was 6 miles away when the shot was fired. Can prove it. And someone erased my dashcam footage the same night. Someone with depot access, which means someone connected to your district, not the Calloways." Dante went very still. "Say that again." She said it again, slower, and watched the color leave his face. He didn't ask her how she knew. He didn't threaten her into silence, which she'd half expected. Instead he asked quietly, "Who has access to that depot besides EMS staff?" "Officially, nobody. Unofficially, someone paid somebody off, or someone in your organization has a friend who works the loading contracts next door and borrowed a badge." Mara studied him. "You already have a name in your head." "I can see it." Dante's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. The particular terrible stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the people closest to him. Victor had run Harbor District contracts, including the depot's loading dock security, for 11 years. Victor had been the one to suggest the barricade in the first place, framing it as protection. "If you're right," Dante said, "then someone under my command started a war I didn't order, using a girl who had nothing to do with it, and let me believe it was the Calloways." "I don't know who did it," Mara said. "I know who didn't." Dante's jaw worked. I could handle this my way. Tonight. Quietly. If you handle it before there's proof, you'll never know if you got the right man, and neither will anyone else. You'll just have more blood and the same lie standing behind it. Mara folded her arms. I didn't drive through your barricade to hand you an excuse for a war. I did it to save a patient. If you want my help proving what actually happened, I'll give it. But we do it with proof, not bullets. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Somewhere behind Mara in the apartment, she heard Eli's chair scrape back from the table, the small ordinary sound of a life she was risking to protect. All right, Dante said finally. Proof then. But you should understand, the man I suspect has 15 years of loyalty behind him, and half my organization would follow him before they'd follow a stranger who broke my roadblock 3 nights ago. If we're wrong about this, or if we can't prove it cleanly, it isn't just your job on the line anymore. Mara held his gaze. It never was just my job. He nodded slowly, and something in the set of his shoulders eased, as though he'd been bracing for her to walk away from the whole mess and found, instead, someone willing to stand in the middle of it with him. There's a dockmaster's office on the East Pier, he said. Empty most days. Nobody watches it, which means nobody will notice us using it. Noon tomorrow. Bring whatever you have. I'll bring whoever I trust enough to still call trustworthy, which, as of tonight, is a shorter list than it was this morning. That's not a lot to build a case on, Mara said. It's what we have. Dante glanced past her into the apartment, at the ordinary shape of a life he'd just walked into uninvited. A table, 2 mismatched chairs, a stack of textbooks that belonged to a boy trying to become an engineer. I'm sorry for bringing this to your door. I mean that. You didn't bring it, Mara said. Your barricade did. You're just the first person from that side of the city who's shown up to actually fix it instead of bury it. He nodded once, the closest thing to agreement he seemed capable of giving a stranger, and told her to be at the old dockmaster's office at noon the next day. Not as a threat, but as the start of something neither of them could yet call a partnership. After he left, Mara stood in her doorway for a long time, watching the black car pull away down a street that suddenly felt smaller than it had that morning. She thought about the version of tonight where she'd simply closed the door, said nothing, let the harbor district settle its own violence the way it always had, long before she'd ever driven through it. That version of tonight left her job intact and her conscience in pieces. She'd made harder trades before for less certain reasons. Eli found her still standing there a few minutes later. Who was that? Someone I'm going to have to trust a little, Mara said, and watch very closely while I do it. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay awake running the wound pattern through her mind again and again, the angle, the range, the absence of the chaos a real crossfire would have left behind, until it stopped feeling like evidence and started feeling like the outline of a decision someone else had made on purpose, carefully, the way you plan something you intend to survive. The dockmaster's office became, over the following days, the quiet center of an investigation neither Mara nor Dante could afford to run publicly. They kept it simple the way Mara insisted it had to be. One clue, the wound's close-range angle, which she documented formally with a retired trauma surgeon's signature so it couldn't be dismissed as her word alone. One witness, a dock worker named Hollis, the same man who'd called in the shooting and then run, who Mara tracked down through hospital dispatch records and convinced, gently, that he was in more danger staying silent than speaking. Hollis had seen a car near the containers that night. Not a Calloway vehicle, but one he recognized from years of loading Victor Lasco's shipments. One independent verification. A pawnbroker 2 districts over who'd taken in a handgun matching the wound's caliber, sold to him by a man Dante's own people confirmed ran errands for Victor. And finally the piece that would matter most, a recording. Getting it took the riskiest week of Mara's life. Dante's people wired the dockmaster's office itself, betting that Victor, growing confident that his plan was working, would eventually come there to check on Dante's state of mind. It worked on the 6th day, when Victor arrived expecting to find a grieving, furious Dante ready to march on Calloway territory, and instead found him calm, asking careful questions about depot access logs that made Victor, just once, say too much. A reference to making sure the timing lined up. a phrase that meant nothing to anyone except the three people in that room who already knew what they were listening for. The recording itself nearly didn't happen. The first 2 days, Victor stayed away from the dockmaster's office entirely, conducting his business elsewhere, and Mara began to worry that Hollis's nerve would break before Victor's confidence did. The dock worker had already asked, twice, whether he could simply disappear upstate to a cousin's house until this was over. Mara talked him out of it both times, not with promises of safety, which she couldn't honestly give him, but with the plain fact that Sofia Calloway was 17 and recovering in a hospital bed because nobody had been willing to say the true thing out loud in time to stop it the first time. "I keep thinking about that," Hollis admitted on the second night, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "That if I just told the first cop who showed up what I saw, maybe none of this drags on this long." "You told the truth to the person who could actually use it," Mara said. "That's not nothing. That's the whole job." In between the evidence gathering, there were quieter hours. Dante, without an audience, was a different man than the one from the news photos. He asked Mara once, over bad diner coffee at 2 in the morning, how her brother's engineering program was going, and listened to the answer like it mattered. When he offered, later that week, to simply make her suspension disappear with a phone call and a donation to the hospital board, Mara refused. "I want my license back because the review board looked at the truth and cleared me," she said. "Not because you bought it back for me. I'll take my chances with the truth." Dante studied her for a long moment. "Most people take the money. I'm not most people you deal with." He respected the boundary, though she could see it cost him something. Patience, mostly, and the certainty that money solved every problem in front of him. It was the first real thing he'd given up for her sake. And neither of them named it as such, but both of them noticed. By the end of the week, Victor, unaware how close the noose had drawn, made one final overconfident move. He requested to personally escort Mara to the emergency hospital board hearing that would decide her suspension, ostensibly as a gesture of goodwill from the Kovarik family. Dante agreed to let him, for one simple reason. "Let him walk in believing he's still in control," Dante said. "It's the last time he gets to." Mara nodded, checked the folder of evidence one final time, and understood that whatever happened in that hearing room the next morning, there would be no quiet way out of it for anyone. That final night, unable to sleep, she sat at her kitchen table with the folder spread open in front of her, reading through it one more time the way she double-checked every set of vitals before handing a patient off to a trauma team, not because she doubted the numbers, but because a life was riding on them being right. Eli wandered in near midnight, saw the papers, and for once didn't ask her to explain. He just made 2 cups of tea, set one down beside her elbow, and sat with her in silence until she finally closed the folder and told him, simply, that tomorrow would either fix things or make them a great deal worse, and that either way, she needed him to go to his morning class like nothing was wrong. "You're really doing this," he said. "Not a question." "Someone has to say the true thing out loud," Mara said. "Might as well be the person who already broke every other rule to get here." He hesitated at the door. "What happens if they don't believe you? If Victor's men are in that room too, and it goes bad? Then Dante has a decision to make in front of everyone who matters to him, and I'll have done everything I could to make that decision as hard to avoid as possible." Mara managed something close to a smile. "Go to class, Eli. I mean it." He went eventually, though he texted her twice before 9 a.m. just to make sure she hadn't vanished into the same silence that had swallowed the story of that first night on the harbor road. The hospital boardroom was full by 10 a.m., Corwin at the head of the table, the disciplinary panel beside him, and at Dante's insistence, a representative from the Calloway family seated across from a visibly uneasy Victor Lasco, present under the pretense of keeping the peace. Mara stood when Corwin called her name, the folder steady in her hands, her pulse the calm, practiced rhythm she used on every call where someone else's life depended on her staying clear-headed. "I'm not here to argue that I broke a roadblock," she said. "I did. Do it again. I'm here because the story everyone was told about that night is false, and I can prove it." She laid it out the way she'd triage a patient, most urgent fact first. The wound angle, verified by an independent trauma surgeon, inconsistent with Crossfire. The dispatch logs placing the blamed soldier 6 miles from the scene. Hollis, present by prior arrangement, corroborating a vehicle he recognized from Victor Lasco's own shipments. The pawned weapon, traced through an independent broker with no connection to either family. And last, the recording, Victor's own voice, 3 days old, discussing making sure the timing lined up. Victor's easy smile didn't waver, not entirely, but his knuckles whitened on the arm of his chair. "This is a paramedic's guesswork dressed up as evidence," he said. "A wound angle, a coincidence with a phone signal, a dockhand who'll say anything for money." "Hollis wasn't paid," Mara said. "He was scared. There's a difference, and everyone in this room who's ever run an operation like yours knows it." The Calloway representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Renata, leaned forward. "You're telling us my employer's daughter was shot on purpose, by someone inside the Kovarik organization, specifically to make it look like my family did it?" "That's what the evidence says," Mara said. "I didn't come here with a theory. I came here with proof, because a theory almost got a war started that would have killed people who had nothing to do with any of it, starting with a 17-year-old girl." Every eye in the room turned to Dante. He could have protected Victor. 15 years of loyalty pulled at him visibly. Mara watched it happen, watched the calculation behind his eyes, the version of this moment where he chose the man who'd stood beside his father, chose reputation, chose the comfortable lie that kept his organization from fracturing. Instead, Dante stood. "Victor built half of what I run," he said quietly to the room. "And Victor nearly started a war that would have killed people on both sides of this table to save his own relevance. I trusted him without ever once asking him to prove he'd earned it again. That's on me as much as it's on him." He looked at Renata. "Your daughter's shooter answers to me, not to you, and not to bullets in an alley. He answers in the open, the way this should have happened from the start." Victor's composure finally broke. "You'd choose her, a stranger, a paramedic, over 15 years. "I choose the truth," Dante said. "You stopped being loyal to me the moment you decided a child's life was an acceptable price for staying important." Security, Dante's own men, not police, at his explicit insistence that this be handled inside the family rather than dumped onto a justice system that would bury it in bureaucracy for years, escorted Victor out, stripped of authority. His territory and contracts reassigned that same afternoon. His fate left in the hands of an internal reckoning that would cost him everything he'd built without costing anyone else a life. The disciplinary board, faced with documented, independently verified proof, voted unanimously to clear Mara's suspension and reinstate her license, with a formal note in her file describing the crossing not as a violation, but as a defensible emergency action. Renata studied Mara for a long moment after the room began to empty. "Sofia's stable. She's asking for the name of the driver who got her here. Tell her it's Mara," she said. "Tell her she doesn't owe me anything for doing my job." Corwin, gathering his papers with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking, caught Mara before she reached the door. "I asked you to sign a lie," he said quietly. "I want you to know I regret that more than you probably think I do. Then make sure the next person who's asked to sign one has an easier time saying no than I did," Mara said, and meant it as something closer to advice than forgiveness. Outside in the hallway, Dante found her by the window overlooking the ambulance bay where, 3 weeks earlier, she'd carried a bleeding stranger through doors she hadn't known would lead here. "You didn't have to phrase it that carefully in there," he said. "You could have made this simpler for yourself and harder for me." "I wasn't trying to make it easy for either of us," Mara said. "I was trying to make it true. Those aren't always the same thing, but today they happen to line up." Dante almost smiled. "That's a rare thing in my line of work. In mine too, more than people think." Down the hall, hospital staff were already wheeling a cart of files toward records, the machinery of an ordinary institution resuming its ordinary business, indifferent to the fact that a small war had nearly started and quietly ended inside its walls. Mara watched them go and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, the particular exhaustion that comes after a long shift finally ends. Not relief exactly, just the settling weight of having carried something all the way to where it needed to go. "For what it's worth," Dante said, "Sofia is asking to meet the driver who broke the rules to save her. Properly, not just a name passed along by her father's lawyer. "I'd like that," Mara said. I never got to see her face without a monitor screaming over it. 6 months later, the harbor road was open in both directions, day and night, with a new blue sign bolted to a lamppost that hadn't been there before. A designated protected corridor for emergency vehicles, agreed to jointly by the Kovarik and Calloway organizations after a truce neither family had believed possible a year earlier. Sofia Calloway walked with a slight limp that the doctors said would fade with time. She'd testified in a private sit-down between the two families that she remembered a face in the dark before the shot, Victor's, closing the last open question of that night for good. Mara's job was fully reinstated, along with a new city EMS protocol, drafted in part from her own recommendations, guaranteeing ambulance crews protected passage through contested territory, with a direct emergency line that no roadblock could legally ignore again. Eli started his final semester with his tuition, for once, entirely paid. Not by Dante's money, which Mara had refused a second time, but by a scholarship the hospital board created in the aftermath, named for the incident review that had, in the end, gotten something right. Dante restructured how his organization verified trust, no longer assuming loyalty from tenure alone, building in the kind of independent checks that might have caught Victor's ambition years before it turned violent. Cost him comfort. It cost him the easy certainty of running things exactly as his father had. He decided that was a fair price. He and Mara kept in contact carefully, the way two people do when neither is certain what they're building. A coffee here, a phone call there, an easy conversation that had nothing to do with wounds or roadblocks or war. Nothing was promised. Nothing was rushed. What existed between them was still becoming itself, built one honest choice at a time instead of one dramatic gesture, which was, Mara thought, probably the only kind of trust that ever really lasted. On a quiet Tuesday that autumn, Dante showed up at the laundromat unannounced. No black car this time, just a man in a plain coat carrying 2 coffees, and asked if she had 20 minutes. They sat on the curb outside her apartment like two people with nowhere important to be, and he told her almost sheepishly that he'd started asking his lieutenants questions he used to consider beneath him. Where money moved, who signed off on what, why a decision had been made the way it had. "It's slower," he admitted. "Everyone hates it. It's also the only reason I'll know sooner next time, instead of 6 months after a girl's already bleeding on a pier." Mara didn't tell him it made her proud of him exactly, because that wasn't quite her place, and they weren't quite there yet. But she let the silence between them sit easy instead of tense, and that, for both of them, said enough. Eli, for his part, remained blissfully unaware of half of what his sister had actually done that season, certain only that some hospital board mix-up had gotten sorted out and that a scholarship had, against all odds, appeared exactly when they needed it. Mara let him believe the simpler version. Some truths were hers to carry so he wouldn't have to. Sofia Calloway did eventually come to find her, not through a lawyer or a formal introduction, but on an ordinary afternoon, waiting outside the EMS depot with the same small gold anchor pendant around her neck that Mara remembered from that first terrible night. "I wanted to say thank you properly," Sofia said, a little awkward, 17 and still getting used to being someone people worried about. "And I wanted you to know I don't blame the family that almost stopped you. I blame the one man who tried to use me to start something that had nothing to do with me at all. That's a wiser thing to understand at 17 than most people manage by 40, Mara told her. "I had a good teacher," Sofia said, glancing toward the depot doors. "Turns out the person who saved me works 2 blocks from where I go for physical therapy now." "Small city." Mara laughed, surprising herself with how easy it felt. "Small city," she agreed, "with a slightly quieter harbor road than it used to have." They stood there a moment longer in the ordinary afternoon light, two people whose worlds had collided on the worst night of one of their lives and left something unexpectedly steady behind. Proof, if either of them needed it, that the truth, chased down carefully enough and spoken plainly enough, really could outlast the war it had been meant to prevent. The lesson of that night stayed with her long after the bruises from the barricade's side mirror had faded. Loyalty that never gets questioned isn't loyalty at all. It's just an unlocked door, waiting for the wrong person to walk through it. Dante had trusted Victor completely for 15 years, and that trust, never tested, nearly cost a child her life and 2 families a war neither would have survived intact. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you'd spent 15 years trusting someone completely, would you have had the courage to question them the moment the evidence pointed their way, even knowing it might cost you everything you'd built together? If this story moved you, tell me what you would have done in Mara's place at that barricade. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed. There's another one waiting for you next week.